Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Liu, for joining us today. I want to continue the conversation that Mr. Price started about amnesia regarding the past. Do you recall what the unemployment rate was in December of 2006? It was about 4.4%. The unemployment rate in December of 2010 was in the mid-9s. I would submit that the legislative, what you claimed that you inherited was due to a legislative process that occurred during that 4-year period, and that wasn't controlled on this side of the aisle. I'm new to this job. I've been in it about 6 weeks. Before I did this, I was a CPA and a CFO and a CEO for a number of successful companies. And so I know what it's like to sign the front side of a paycheck, to make the decision to commit to hire an employer, to make an investment. This so-called plan doesn't put me in a position, if I were in that chair today, to do that. The other thing is that I've learned some interesting, I know a little bit about businesses and budgeting, and I've learned some new terminology. Sustainable deficits is a new term, and then primary balance, that's another interesting term. When Chairman Bernanke was here last week, he said that the federal deficit over the long term should not exceed the interest cost that we pay on our debt. We have come up with this definition of primary balance that it's okay to run a deficit of 3% of GDP. How many businesses and families do you know of that can operate in primary balance, and for how long?
We haven't set the goal of stopping at primary balance. We've said you have to get to primary balance in order to get beyond that. And I think it's an important difference.
This doesn't get better than primary balance.
You're not going to get to balance if you don't pass through primary balance.
Yeah, let me submit to you that most families and most businesses that I know of cannot operate in primary balance. I commend you for having balanced budgets during the Clinton administration. That's what I call primary balance, is where you have zero deficit or a surplus. The question I have is...
If I could just respond on the first point, I think most families have had some experience with building up balances on their credit card that they really were facing really hard decisions.
But they don't do it over 10 years.
No, they don't do it. They start by cutting up the card, not putting more on it, and that's what primary balance is.
They start by cutting their net deficit to zero, and this plan doesn't do that. My questions are this: you've got average spending during what was the? Let me rephrase that.
I'm going to have to bring historical statistics with me the next time I testify.
Well, I can answer it for you. But do you recall what spending was as a percent of GDP during the Clinton administration?
It was around 20%.
Correct. And what is the average spending as a percent of GDP under this plan?
I think that when you look at spending as a percentage of GDP over time, it does grow as the population grows because people become eligible for Social Security and Medicare. So when one talks about those numbers, you have to look at what's behind them. And not all spending.
23%. And if we really wanted to develop a plan that was on to have sustainable deficits of zero or primary balance of zero, we should have spending down around the same level as taxes, and that's around 18.3% of GDP over the long term.
You don't get to balance, you don't get to balance if your revenue and your spending don't cross. The question is at what level they cross, providing what we need for the country.
I understand. I yield back.